Welcome back, Weirdos, to another episode of the Weird and Strong podcast. As always, I am your host, Jeremy Grinsteiner. We've got another episode for my fellow weightlifting nerds out there. A double feature of guests, both Max Aita and Joshua Gibson. In this episode, we're exploring a fusion of science, philosophy, training, and the importance of a foundational approach. This episode is packed with strategies for improving as both weightlifters and coaches. Enjoy the episode, and remember, stay strong, stay curious, most importantly, stay weird. Josh, how you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. It's quite different to be on the other side of the mic. Literally, it's the same side, but this time being interviewed instead of doing the interviewing. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, very cool. And welcoming back, Max. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm well. I'm doing really well. Just living the dream. One day closer to death, one foot in the coffin.
That always reminds me
standard kind of stuff.
It always reminds me of my favorite birthday song of if you guys are familiar with Aurelio Voltaire. He's kind of a gothy, rocky, alternative guy. He's got a birthday song, or his happy birthday, my old friend. It seems this horror show will never end. It's something about something you're closer to your last breath, and here's to one day closer to death.
Wow.
Sounds a little dark.
It really just resonates with me. That's I feel that. I feel that on a regular basis.
We're gonna have to make sure to send that one to Max on his birthday whenever that comes up.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
As we start every guest or two guests on this podcast, I've got a weird question for you guys. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Awesome. Josh, I'm going to start with you. Imagine yourself in a universe where pro wrestling and weightlifting have been combined and merged. You're set to compete, and you have to set yourself a walkout song. What walkout song are you picking for your weightlifting competition?
That's a fantastic question. I love that we're developing alternate, universes in which we operate. This one happens to clash or bring together weightlifting and wrestling. And for my walkout song, you know what? I'm going to make it as predictable as possible. And I'm going to say Enter the Sandman by Metallica.
Entre Sandman. Funny enough, so I just recently retired from my gigging life as a musician, and that was the last song we played.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Wow. What a coincidence.
Yeah. Max, how about you? What is your, I know it's been a while since you've been on the competition platform. What song is going to bring you back out?
What even is music? Let's break that down. Let's get down to the sound waves hitting our eardrums and really think about this. I have no idea. Someone asked me last night, what's your favorite song? And I don't have like a favorite song. I mean, there's a lot of songs I'll listen to that I like, but I've never thought of like, oh, this is my favorite, or I don't know what a walkout song would be. Probably it'd always be something humorous to me. So, would probably be some kind of, I don't know, some super bad poppy song from the 80s, or maybe like a Cyndi Lauper, True Colors or something, just to be weird and confusing.
Give people
something
a
like
bit of a questioning,
Yeah.
like who's actually about to come out.
Right. Well, versus like the predictable, Metallica song. It's like everyone's gonna hear that, and they're just gonna be tuned out by the time the chorus comes around. You want someone engaged. You want them really fired up. You want people to hate you. I can't control whether people are gonna love me when I walk out, but I can definitely get them to hate me.
Well, it was like I just saw it was in retrospective of somebody like the Macho Man who came out to Pomp and Circumstance, where you're like, this is supposed to be like, this is a guy who's wearing a neon cowboy hat and shades, and he comes out to this regal tune. It really makes people go, what is actually happening?
Right. And you almost wonder like how much of how much of those pro wrestlers, like as anything progresses and gets more refined, you get more and more of like I'm sure the current batch of pro wrestlers have like, come up and groomed themselves through it and
Right.
like they are 100% through and through within the culture.
Hmm.
But the old days, it was like, the pro wrestler wasn't a profession. You
Yeah.
became something like that. It's like, if you're listening to like a Hulk Hogan's story, it's like he was like a guy who was, doing all this weird shit and, somehow ended up in it. So
Hmm.
like how much of those guys were just like, it was just a inside joke for them to be everything the way they were, you know?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, juxtaposing this to the UFC, you have like UFC one, and it's like a sumo wrestler versus
Oh
like a
yeah.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu grappler, and it's like the most nonsensical that like what is
Yeah.
happening. That's kind of what wrestling was like back in the day with like Mick
Hmm.
Foley and
Right.
all these guys where it's just like pieced together, ragtag, rugged. You're throwing people off of like, the top of a cage onto tacks on the
Hmm.
on the rink, on the ring, and now it's like, yeah, super groomed, super like cosmetic and aesthetic and theatrical.
Practiced.
So yeah,
Yeah.
changes a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas you look back, it was like, how much of that were they just making up on the fly?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Most of it. Yeah. Where they're
Right.
like, we're gonna figure something out and we're gonna make it happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Just like you and your buddy just, stripped down to your skivvies, oiled up, grabbing each other's thick, hard, veiny muscles and, just getting next to each other. A couple of bros rubbing nips. Maybe the lips touch. Maybe it's only 10, 20
And
seconds at most, but they did touch.
you got to make sure you got to make sure a whole crowd of other guys is
Oh
watching.
yeah. A lot of men, just lots of men watching us struggle with each other's bodies.
I'm glad this is titled the Weird and Strong podcast because I think Max definitely provides the weird. I'm not sure if he any longer provides the strong, but he can at
Definitely
least
not.
meet one of those criteria.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, and I appreciate that because I mean, it's making me laugh. So, I mean, that's, in my book, that's one of the things that I value a lot and value the
Yeah.
most. Thinking about into weightlifting, because, ultimately, if you describe weightlifting a bit wrong, we strap on a bunch of spandex, wear some high heels, and lift some heavy weights over our head with our bros. Uh, Thinking to the lifters in the world, since you both have gone through and had careers as weightlifters and competed, what are some of the things that, or if you were to start over today or start over from scratch, let's say you're learning as a beginner again, knowing some of the things that you do know, what are the areas that you would focus on now as a beginner versus perhaps where you started from?
Yeah. I mean, my mind instantly jumps to I would find someone who can help me develop a process for figuring out what works and what doesn't. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there are 1,001 ways to make someone better. I mean, we see that through the wide variety of weightlifting coaches and the wide variety of methodologies they use. It's all weightlifting, but the iterations can be, pretty stark, and people are still getting better, right? People are
Mm-hmm.
still setting, we had Hampton Morris set a world record, and I don't think anyone else trains like him. Like no one trains equivalent to him. I would say very few people train equivalent to Olivia Reeves. You go to a local meet and you're going to see a large diversity of how people train too.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that really matters to me is, do you have a process by which you can track changes in performance and technique and really how people are taking to the training, and then you can make modifications that make sense. So when I started, I did 1,001 different programs, and I look back and I think, wow, that one really worked. What worked about it? And it's like, well, did it work because it was the program or the time point or like my stage in my lifting?
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to single in on if you don't have a process that's a bit more strategic, a bit more well thought out, and a bit more well kind of like understood and documented. So you need good record keeping. And I
Yeah.
think kind of from start to finish, I wish I would have had that laid out so I could look back at trends and pick up on them. And with athletes I coach, that's kind of the big thing is, what works, what doesn't, what can we change? And then how do we know if the change is having an effect?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say for people starting out, for beginners, intermediates, like find a process that you can adhere to over a longer period of time. And that's just going to give you good information for future training. And then also for understanding what good coaching is also like.
Totally. And so in looking at that, when you're talking about a process, is that primarily in as far as like the like programming like methodology, or are you looking more at like a lower level or like more basic approach to this of have some way to like you said, document through like a training journal or something like that so that you have some sort of data to work from?
I'd say it can be top down or it can be bottom up. And I think kind of the idea of like something is better than nothing. If you just document your training in a journal, you can look back on it. It might be a little tedious,
Hmm.
but if you get coaching or you write a program in some sort of data manage, like place where you can manage the data or look at the data, I think it just makes it simple. It makes it simple. You can visualize it, and then you can reflect back on it and like click between sheets, click between weeks, click between like training blocks, and say
Hmm.
like, "Wow, we got great results. What did training kind of look like?" And then we can pick up on patterns and trends and try and map out like what could that look like in the future. And I think so many people get into it and they either don't track their training, don't understand their training, or don't have a process by which training evolves over time. And they're just kind of always looking at different things, comparing, apples to, russet potatoes. It's not even apples to
Yeah.
oranges, right? It's like fruits to vegetables to,
Hmm.
to legumes to other things. So I think just having something that's comparable and trackable over time is tremendous. And that's when my coaching took off. So as an
Hmm.
athlete, your results would be even better. I mean, I just had someone who jerked, he jerked 160 for the first time, and that was like a massive lift. And we just kind of had a process for getting there. And we're going to use that same process the next time we jerk 170 or when we do
Hmm.
jerk 170.
Yeah.
So I think that is incredibly helpful.
Cool. Max, for you, looking back, similar question. What were the things that when you got started lifting, that you perhaps looking back say, maybe that wasn't super helpful, or you got distracted by certain paths? What were those like for you as you started to develop your lifting?
This is a tough question to answer because, like, when I think back on everything I did, if I did it differently, I might have ended up in a different place today.
Hmm.
I may not have become a coach. I may not have done these other things. So, the obvious answer kind of to echo what Josh said is I would, you know, I didn't I think I put myself into two camps, or I think people do this, or they have two different types of mentalities. One is which you take a call it a thoughtful approach, a methodical tracking, writing programs, tracking what you're doing, recording, adhering to a a principled approach. And then the other is living in the cloud of hopefulness, which is like I kind of wing it. I go heavy
Hmm.
or I go light, and it's easy. You guys just think it's easy, or you think it's too hard, or and I think the problem is that there's a belief that those two things can't coexist, that
Mm.
you can't have a training approach that is both intuitive, in which you strike while the iron's hot and you max out a little bit more often, or when you feel good, you go up, or you go quote unquote off program, and having a methodical like training process and program where there's sets and reps listed and you have a plan and you execute, and like those two things can very much coexist. It's just a matter of, one, like Josh said, like being able to actually record and track what you're doing,
Hmm.
keeping good records of anything you're doing at this complex level is just key. So I would have done that more and tried to be try to reconcile those two sort of beliefs, that those two things are extreme ends of the spectrum, that you can't you can't do the Bulgarian system and record your training and look at it and see if there's a trend,
Hmm.
because God forbid you'd find out that it's stupid. um you know so it's like I would have tried to be more in a place that like have a plan, but it's definitely okay to like push and to push
Mm.
yourself and to drive outside the envelope and like try to move the needle when you can.
Hmm.
Um, I think I think that's just sort of this like it's it exists in the sphere now of that's how things have to be. It's like you're either one or the other. You're either a
Mhm.
nerd or you're just like it's not hard, dude, just do it
Just
kind
lift
of
more.
camp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked a bit about that on the last episode. Um, in looking at that of like having some sort of a process, especially for people who are getting started as lifters or who are very new in their in learning the lifts or in learning how to compete. What what are the types of things that you've encountered in working with athletes that have prevented them from finding that process in the past?
I mean, the for me, the biggest thing is that they just are not, they're not organized in normal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's funny when you think about dieting, I think dieting is the best example, the best analogy here. It's so easy to not be to not lose weight. It's so easy.
Yeah.
You just eat a little bit too much and you won't lose any weight. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, it's one of the miracles of modern society in that we can largely stave off starvation pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, when you think about dieting, it's like you have to do two things. You have to know exactly how much you've eaten because it's just a purely like, it's a purely uh, energy in versus energy out kind of thing. If you know how much you ate, then you know how much, you approximately what you're going to burn every day. And you can look at a scale and there you go. You can see if it goes up or down, make an adjustment. Some people can't do that. Some people just can't even do that basic thing of like write down everything I eat during the day and count the calories, count the macros, look at it, and then make an adjustment and then repeat the
Mm-hmm.
same thing the next day. In process, that is so simple. That's like such a
Yeah.
very basic thing. That is the minimum amount of effort, and it's really hard for a lot of people. Now, granted, there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of psychological stuff around it, and there's a whole slew of things there for sure. But the point being, like, just to develop a methodical process, most people struggle with the actual implementation of really simple things like, do you write down all of your training? You know, do
Mm-hmm.
you film all of your lifts? I don't know if you guys remember a guy named Martin Rooney who used to work, I don't know if he still does, or used to work for Parisi, Bill Parisi, the speed school. This is like
Mm-hmm.
early
Yeah.
2000s, early 2000s. He came out to Montana and did a little seminar at the university when I was there. And this you have to imagine this is probably like 2002 maybe. And at the time, like he was like I mean, that was like the cutting edge of sports performance stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember asking him, like, what would you do? I was a weightlifter and he didn't really know anything about it. I was like, well, do you have any suggestions for me? Like, what would you do? And he's like, yeah, you should film every lift you do and you should look at them. You should track everything. And like, it was like a basic thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of funny because like that was 22 years ago.
Mm.
And now we have the technology for these things. Yet it's like it hasn't changed. Like people don't write down their training, they don't log anything, they don't like look at it's just like weird. So I say it's hard to start a process. The biggest thing is just people's literal ability to sit down and do it is the biggest hurdle, you know?
Yeah. And I think too, the idea of like a good coach basically is being able to meet someone where they're at,
Mm-hmm.
and understand what people need. And I think it's kind of a straw man to say like, well, you would either be, only kind of theory heavy and scientific and analytical, or you would be intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
That's untrue. It's like I coach all the time and I coach in both realms. And you get someone who I start working with someone who's an endurance athlete, and it's like you go on, it's like, what are we doing today? It's like, oh, we'll do a progression for the lift, we'll do some strength work, we'll do some hypertrophy work. And it's like I'll kind of come up with it on the spot. Um, but then you have someone who's like a really high level, strength athlete, and it's much more detailed. But even then, you're in the session with them, and it's like we're doing doubles instead of triples. Let's
Mm-hmm.
push a little bit. Let's modify this, and a lot of it's because a plan that was laid out a day ago, a week ago, a month ago is a day old, a week old, a month old, and you've updated your understanding of like the process since then. And it could be small and be very minute changes, but like you've updated your prior probabilities of what's going to work since. So you make adjustments, as a session unfolds, because basically you're constantly getting new information. So to Max's point, I'd kind of reiterate that like coaching is a process. It's a process of like capturing data, but it's a process of using new data to inform decision making. And then kind of to your point, I remember Glenn Pendlay would always say like you should log your training, track your training, be methodical about changes. And I think his perspective was slightly different, but it was that same idea. It's like if we change things slowly and on a smaller scale, we can better understand exactly what's having an effect. And that kind of ignores the complexity of existence. But I think it makes sense, and it made sense to him as a coach having his own process. So I think to Max's point, people struggle largely because it's just something new in general. It's like work you have to do. It's a behavior you have to decide to do and to make. And that's tough. And it's also tough because it's not just like train and then you'll get the results you want. It's like there's a lot more to it than that. There's training and being thoughtful about your training, making good decisions. It's a much more complete and complex process than just like showing up and lifting some weights overhead. And if it were that simple, I mean, it was that simple at one time, but there was just a gross amount of drugs being used. I'm thinking back to like the 50s and 60s in the USA. Now it's like, okay, how can we train effectively, train hard, manage fatigue, and do that to reach, as close to the top of your abilities as we can. And it's just got to be more strategic, more thoughtful on both ends, right? Where it's an involved process. And I think that takes like growth and learning from the athlete to be responsible for that and then to be able to execute on it.
Absolutely. And like when you talked about that, this sense of if I just train and I do the weights that's listed on my program, I should get this result. We tend to think very linearly, especially as in the beginner realm, that's how this works. If I do work, I get result. And especially with the the extra amounts or like the bigger amounts of online programs out there that are really like static programs that you buy online, find online for free, whatever that looks like, to be able to follow, to your point, Josh, where you talked about, I think I tried 1,000 different programs my first year or whatever. It can get very easy to be stuck into that mindset and quit very early, especially if you haven't gone and found yourself a coach to help you find that ability to make those adjustments or help you discover what that's like.
Could I jump in real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's a great point. And I think what's the easiest trap to fall into is you have a proximal effect, and then you use that as like an identifying feature, right? It's like I didn't get results, therefore I'm not going to get results anymore, or therefore I'm not going to improve, or therefore I'm weak, therefore I'm bad at this. It's like this proximal effect of the program didn't work. Yeah, I've written a lot of programs that fucking suck. Like, what do you want me to say?
Most of them.
It's true. It's very true. Like, what do you want me to say? But I've also written programs that have gotten like massive PRs and a slew of lifts, and it's taken a lot of time and a lot of work on both ends. But not at one point did I say, you've reached your limit. That's your potential. Like, you're not going to make a PR. But people will tell you that. They'll run a program. I didn't make a result. I haven't PR'd in a year. I'm just not going to be able to squat more weight. That's my life now. Like, I'm confined to this destiny of being a weak sack of, flesh that just roams the earth. It's like, that's not true. That's not true. And then they hit a PR 4 weeks later. And it's like, you just, as a coach, you think, this is how I think. There's a perfect program. How do I get to that? As an athlete, I did the perfect program. I didn't get results. Those are two different, perspectives. And I think a good coach just keeps people on the line or on the hook, so to speak, long enough so they can get the results they're working for. And it's realizing that like training isn't linear, but it's also additive. And that like, if you can do training that'll build muscle, that'll pay off eventually. I don't know when, but it's not like We didn't get results, therefore we're not good or we're not going to be good. And that's it. That's the end of the road. We're done.
Yeah. You create this identity around your last result.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I talk about this with some of my lifters very often is that, well, it's your decision if you want to quit right now or not and make that failure your defining feature, or you could show up again and give it another whack. Like, good friend of mine, we talk about very often that the point of the sport is failure, because that's how you know where your capacity is, or that's where you know where your abilities are. And so finding that failure point isn't necessarily a defining feature for us, but it is a way
Right.
for us to figure out how to move forward.
It's data, right? I mean, as coaches, you're agnostic to it. You're saying that didn't work, that did work. I really don't care why. I mean, I have no emotional attachment to the outcome. I want to know why so I can change the outcome. But like, you miss a snatch, like there's a great quote from Glenn I actually pulled recently, but it's like, what's the worst thing that can happen if you miss a lift? Well, you drop the barbell.
Yeah.
And like nuance, caveat, whatever, but like you drop the bar, you pick it up, you try again. That's the worst outcome. That's the typical outcome. And it's just good information of like, oh, but you tend to lift like this when it's too heavy, when it's heavier. You tend to do this when you're really, really fatigued. This is how it expresses itself. So we can use those like edges of ability to then help the coaching process.
Absolutely. Max, any thoughts on?
Yeah, I was gonna say I disagree with everything Josh said, mostly because Josh said it. No, I would agree 100%. I think, it's like one of those things that that when you really think about it, it's like in any of these sports, we have certain outcomes. We have desired outcomes, right? We also have some inputs to that. So we don't necessarily need to kind of what Josh's saying. We don't need to care about like we don't need to be emotional about what the mechanisms and what's happening between input and output. We need to have predictability in that, hey, when I increase training volume, this lifter gets bigger. Or when I increase intensity, this guy gets stronger. And then you have all these kind of objectives you're trying to satisfy. Some of them are a duality in that there's like, one objective is lifting the most weight possible, and the other side of that coin is, not getting hurt. And so you're always just making trade-offs in decision making with training. The essence of it just comes down to how am I best organizing my decision making and the trade-offs I choose to make to satisfy the goal, which is the same for every athlete of the person I'm working with, which is lifting more weight. And so you go through and you develop your whole system and methodology just around these trade-offs. A great example of this, or the two examples would be like the Russians or the Bulgarians, or let's say the Americans of the 90s versus the Bulgarians of the 90s. Everyone's presented with the same things in front of them, choices, right? Barbells, exercises, sets and reps, and all these things. And everybody makes choices that are trade-offs, one side for the other, to try to achieve the biggest result they can. Some of those systems go to extremes, giving 11-year-old kids steroids, and some of those systems don't, right? They compete clean or something. But like largely that's all training is as coaches, we're just trying to figure out what the trade-offs are first. And that's like the most fundamental level. What are the trade-offs? Go heavy really often. Okay, well, the risk of getting hurt goes up, or fatigue is going to get higher, and you might not perform as well. And so like just understanding that is the first level. But then after that, it's like your quote unquote coaching system and style is just emergent from the trade-offs you make. You just choose different things, and like, oh, Josh's style of training and coaching is different than mine. We all have the same choices to make. He just makes, he kind of weights certain things more aggressive, or, more aggressively for his own preference. So I think that's kind of this real fundamental layer of all this that coaches, new coaches, a lot of coaches just don't think in that, they don't see it as that. They see it as like it's a wholly unique and different thing because I think it's different.
Mhm.
Right. I do yo-yo snatches and this guy does pump snatches. He's a fucking idiot. He has no idea. Those pump snatches, they're gonna ruin his QL. And my yo-yo snatches, what they do is they teach the lifter how to be a better person. It's like you're just saying things that you have convinced yourself of your mind that those are true. The reality is that we don't even, maybe there's no research on either one of these things. We have no idea what either one of them does or is. We're just making assumptions. And so you
Yeah.
see it as like this equals that. It's the most common
Mhm.
thing, right? And the most common thing in the world is if my squat goes up, my lifts
Yeah.
go up. And that's not an untrue statement at face value, but it's just one of those like 1 + 1 = 3. See, it's like it's just that simple, guys. Like,
Mhm.
and I've just
See,
convinced
I put the
myself of
numbers.
this. Yeah, the recipe is there. It makes sense, right? It should work. So yeah, it's a game of trade-offs and it's a game of understanding that you're balancing a lot of decisions with the desired outcome. And there's other things that, potentially just in doing them have negative impacts on that outcome. So you're
Mhm.
always trying to, the idea of optimization is just trying to make a lot of really good decisions in those trade-offs
Mm.
such that you end up with a better result than if you'd have made a lot of bad decisions.
Mhm. I really
Yeah,
like
and I
that.
think I was just going to
Yeah.
say I recently recorded a podcast on my podcast, the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, which is kind of digging a little more into the philosophy of science. And there are two things. To Max's point, there's a fallacy called the post hoc ergo propter hoc,
Mhm.
which is since event Y followed event X, Y must have been caused by X, right?
Mhm.
So it's a fallacy. That's just illogical. And then a quote on that podcast I recorded was we were talking a bit about free will, as one does. And
Mhm.
he was saying that like free will is really determined by the affordances that you have. So like the decisions you make are made only in light of the decisions you can make. And as a coach, that's really what you're doing. It's like, what information do I have available? I mean, it's everything. It's athletes, it's equipment, it's location, it's everything. And you're saying, what decisions can I make that constructs my coaching system? I think the best coaches are generally going to have the access to most of the information, right? Most of the information, most of the affordances. That way, you can start to decide and say, like, I think this makes sense in the context of a complex environment, which is this athlete in their career. And you have some weighting on each thing. As Max said, we have different program styles. They're converging a bit because that just makes sense to me. But it's like you weight different things. So if you think putting on muscle is important, you're going to do higher volumes more often. If
Mhm.
you think more bodybuilding work is important, you're going to put that in at the expense of something else, at the expense of training time. If you think technique is more important, you might put in more technical variations and not do quite as many classic lifts. So it's realizing like we all have our rationales. They're all developed on the back of all of the theory, all of the practice, and the integration of all of that. And then the program's the expression. And even that, I told Max, I don't remember when we were talking about this, but in reality, the best coaches can execute, even if they have different amounts of information or access to different information. It's like your ability to execute on it. And Ryan Doris, he was on the podcast too. He's like a philosophical guy, and he was talking about bodybuilding. And he's like, I know all this bodybuilding theory, and I still don't train like I know I should train based on what I know. Why is that? And it's like, for some reason, there's just a disconnect between the theory, what you know, and your ability to apply it to practice. And I think as long as you're moving toward better, I mean, you're doing the best you can. You never quite get to where it's like this is a perfectly written, based on everything program. But it's like, oh, I'm tapering and peaking better. I'm managing volume better. I'm adhering to these basic principles better.
Mhm.
Um, so it's easy to be a bad coach, and it's really, really hard to be a good coach. But I think like knowing more, trying harder, and just repeatedly, doing that over and over and over will get you closer there.
Yeah, that's really cool. The one thing that both of you like this uh gave me the idea or reminded me of is this concept that I've been considering often lately is, you know, we as humans, lifters, coaches, all of the above, any other permutation in there, is that we have this desire to go towards this optimization, especially now in like
Right.
modern lifestyles. And like I look back at some early programs recently that I wrote and looking at, well, how can I optimize to get as many qualities at the same time? I was like,
Yeah.
you make that mistake where you're trying to have everything. And the reality is
Yeah.
exactly what you guys are talking about. There's these trade-offs that you have to make to be able to get the specific qualities that you're looking for or get the intended result. It's like, well, we want to be able to have them look like a bodybuilder and snatch a world record and also have a 6-minute mile or a 4-minute mile.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
reality is that we're trying to confuse too many things and we're trying to create this optimal human that doesn't exist or this optimal idea, this idealistic version of what we think we need versus what's actually reality.
Yeah.
And
James Hoffman calls that the blender effect,
mm,
which is when you're trying to train for everything all at once. You take all the ingredients you have, you throw it into a blender, and then you taste it, and you're like, well, but I had caviar and I had,
yeah,
I don't know what else people like,
or like
Nutella, like
those
taste like shit.
million dollar burgers where they like wrap it in
Yeah,
gold foil
that's
and then
exactly.
you're like, does it taste like does it tell it tastes great? You're like, not really. It just kind of tastes like a burger, I guess, with a bunch of stuff added to it.
Right.
And yeah, where it's, I look back at, my time in software and whatnot and working with people in that regard where they want to have, the priority is this and this and this and this and this. So it's like that idea of, well, if the priority is all these things, it's really the priority is nothing because we're so
Yes.
Yes.
scattered
Yes.
and we're so distracted from where things are.
Yeah. Well, I think that takes being able to have athletes for a long enough period of time to say, I don't have to like hit the panic button and do everything all at once. It's
Mhm.
like, oh, you're just coming back from a layoff. Let's do some light training. Let's just do high volumes. Let's do like, really technically focused variations.
Mhm.
And yeah, you're not going to be able to go heavy for a while. And yeah, you're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z for a while. It's like, we don't need to do it right now. I don't want you to. And like, I don't know how strongly backed all of the like training residual stuff is, where it's like max strength holds on for this long,
Mhm.
muscle size holds on for this long. But like, if you can at least conceptualize it like that, you can think we don't need to be as powerful as possible year round. We need to be
Mhm.
that at a certain time point. We need to be peaked with that quality at a certain time point. So we can spend some time on the back end doing technique work, capacity, hypertrophy, strength, rate of force stuff. And you can see that logical sequence and it actually makes sense instead of saying like, oh, well, I'm going to write the perfect program that does everything, as you mentioned. And it's like, by doing everything, you can't allocate enough space and time to any one thing to make a meaningful difference. So, yeah, you're right. You're kind of doing nothing. So it's
Mhm.
like by subtraction, you get an improved effect or a better effect.
Yeah. Chase,
I
go ahead.
No. I was gonna say, to kind of go back to the original question of like, what would you do differently? I think, and what Josh just said, which is like, we'll have times of higher volume or lower volume, and maybe you're not going to be at the same place all the time. I think the two things I want to say is one, I think that largely people get to a place where they achieve some level of success, and then preservation of that success is the becomes their objective,
Mm,
which is to
Mhm.
say, oh, I got to this numbers where I'm doing, 110, 130, and if I back off on pushing, if I don't snatch 105 every week, I'm not going to feel okay to do 112, right?
Mhm.
Um, and coaches get there too, which is like, if I don't keep my
yeah.
athlete happy or if I don't do this, so you end up in this place where you're kind of largely just there's one, note being played the entire training year. And you see this all the time. Athletes achieve a certain level and then they just kind of stay there. And now at the highest level, that would be expected, right?
Mhm.
If you're snatching 165 and clean jerking 200 as a 73, like, I mean, you're the best in the world. But like just maintaining that is
Mm,
enough to be a very, very good weightlifter with a long career, winning. But like, you know, on the way up, the disruption of ups and downs and modification of training and trying to push the boundary and moving up weight classes, like there has to be there not has to. It is obvious when I look from, you look at the progression of a top level lifter, it is chaotic's the wrong word, but
Mm.
there's a lot of variations happen, a lot of stuff going on. Athletes moving up a weight class, going up and down, getting way stronger, getting bigger, doing things that are moving them outside of that homeostasis to drive them forward, right? Um, and so that's kind of like, I think that's kind of a good or an obvious thing, like the barometer of like how how much is somebody just sort of trapped in this holding on to pattern of like, oh man, I got to just keep them where they're at because if we do anything different, their numbers are going to go down. And if
Hmm.
their numbers go down, that's the worst thing in the world. Now, granted, just doing a bunch of training that makes your numbers go down isn't the goal here, but like, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for people get to a certain point where they've achieved a certain level and they want it to be like they want it to be a permanent thing. And the reality is with performance and with sport, it's just not permanent. It's very transitive, right? It's transitory. It's like it's very much you have it for a minute and then it's gone.
Hmm.
You have some strength, you peak, you drive the results up, and then they dissipate. Um, Anytime you see something that doesn't follow the sort of natural laws of the universe, which is that like what goes up must come down, you
Mm.
know, I think that was Professor Bugs Bunny that said that. But it's like, you have to understand that. And when you become okay with that, and when you become okay with that because you have confidence in your tools, you have no fear of that situation. You have no fear of like, oh, we're going to go up and down. We're going to get
Mm.
in shape, be out of shape. We're going to push for things. Because I know that if we follow these principles in training and do good training, we're going to come back up and we're going to be above those levels. When you don't have a good sense of your abilities as a coach or as an athlete, and you don't feel you can go from a state of being in shape to out of shape to in shape or work on different qualities, you're going to be trapped in this place where you just try to hold on, and that's when everything gets stagnant because you're clutching those numbers, those lifetime intermediate numbers as hard as you can so that they don't go away because that perfect 111 snatch, 121 clean and jerk, like you can't let go of that or others will never get to the big numbers, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and it like becomes that again that belief about self when we have those. Um, in looking at this from the development as a coach and being able to bring some of this forward, um, in looking at what we have for like official coaches education in the weightlifting world, because we don't have the same systems that other countries have as far as coaches education goes. What are the ways that people can start to learn how to figure out how to apply some of these principles to their athletes? How, like, what is that process? What is that process missing now that could be improved?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the outset, it's realizing it's having this might be a Jocko, quote, but it's like a white belt mentality. I don't know who said that, but it's kind of that idea of like I think there were points where I thought I know as much coaching theory as like I need to know. And then you realize like, well, what's the theory founded on? And then you're like, well, I need to understand science.
Mhm.
And then you're like, well, what's the science founded on? It's like I need to understand the philosophy of science. And then you realize like, oh, there are a lot of layers to this. And it's not necessary to know all of it or know all of them or understand it at any like extreme level to be a good coach. But it's like that sense of having a good grasp on the complexity of it and then being able to make good decisions off of it. It's like, oh, well, this science says it's like that science doesn't say anything. The research, the results suggest the available data suggests based on a limited sample.
Mhm.
Um, so you can just weight that a little more effectively. You can alter practices you see sufficient. So I think it takes one like this immense curiosity from the people who are trying to know as much as possible, and then good communication skills on how to hand that down. Max and I obviously have been in the weightlifting, powerlifting, strength sport, communication, education space for what feels like a long time now. And I think for me, it's always been not dumbing down anything, because I feel like to really sell social media, it should be simple and it should be like things people want to watch. I'm not saying you don't do that, but I'm saying catering explicitly to that is kind of problematic. And then also feeling like, the people who are getting into the space, we don't want to overwhelm them with complex information. We don't want to make them have to work. So those two things paired, I think it just waters down the quality of the information and education that comes out. So for me, it's always been, what am I learning? That's what I'm telling whoever I'm talking to. And it's not simple, it's not straightforward, it's not elementary, it's not a 101 class. It can be mechanistic, it can be complex, it can be thought provoking. But the idea is that, like, if you hear it enough, you're exposed to it enough, it elevates you, and then you're able to elevate more people off the back of that. So I would say we're attempting to do that through, the company Coachlogik. We specifically have a mentorship group where we have on experts in the field of strength, power, and performance science, and then we talk about tapering. As Hayden Pritchard has done almost all of the work on tapering in strength sports, specifically weightlifting and powerlifting and maximal strength. He literally talked about all of it. So it's like, what other access are you going to get to the people who are conducting the work? Chris Tabor talked about accentuated eccentric loading. It's like, oh, Power and Grace uses weight releasers. Let me ask, one of their staff. It's like, you should probably ask the people who are studying it and understand it at that level. And then start to implement into practice and say, okay, let's use a process-based approach to figure out if it works or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's one, not watering anything down, providing great information, and then saying, how do we connect you with the people who are developing the information and creating it, and then give you the skills to understand it. So that's the approach I think should be taken, and that we are taking. That currently doesn't exist as well, outside of the scope of, like, here are the positions of the lift, do it like this. Here's a basic, like, you start with a medium amount of volume, you go to a high amount of volume, you deload, and then you test, beyond that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the certification processes of, here's how to teach a lift. Now go do it.
Right.
And fly little fishy. Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been the most, as you guys have launched this mentorship process and bringing in these scientific advisors, people teaching what they've learned, what's been the most surprising thing that has come through in including all of these people into this mentorship group?
What do you think, Max?
That's a good question. I would say, I mean, for me, what's been, I won't say most surprising, but sort of like the thing that would stand out most is just that there's one, I haven't spent nearly as much time like connected to like weightlifting research as I am now, especially like Josh has kind of been, basically my connection to that. But I had a meeting a couple weeks back with Chris Tabor and Christoph Kipp, and I was asking questions that were like, hey, so like what kind of information do we have on like the muscular actions that occur at each phase of the lift and what's going on? He's like, I don't have any of that. he's like there's like five studies. There's like five studies maybe that would have something like that, but what you're asking like kind of doesn't really exist in any form that we have. And it kind of made me realize, one, with the mentorship group, like we have lots of little pieces of information, it's like we have a little tiny flashlight we can shine in the dark and see a thing. And then we're trying to figure out what the thing we're looking at is. And it's become very much more apparent spending this much time around with, much more academic, you know, grounded people, that there's just a lot of like the it depends answers. But also like just a lot of like, we don't know. We're not sure. We have some evidence that supports this, or there's a lot of evidence that supports this being the case. So we're clear on some things. We're clear enough that we can really develop training and coaching around it. And other things, we may not be wrong about, but we haven't really corroborated it yet. We haven't really found evidence to say that why it's happening or why it works. So the mentorship group has given me, just from that perspective, like a whole much better handle on like, yeah, there's really a lot of not definitive answers out there. It doesn't mean we're not right. I mean, we've produced everybody, there's people that win competitions, so something is right.
Yeah.
Like we can't deny that, but it's like definitely like, oh, well, what does the research say about this? Well, there's just not a lot, or there's nothing there. So it's like you have to sort of formulate your own thing and kind of go from there. And I think that's kind of for me, the most surprising thing, or not surprising, but the most like, interesting part of it.
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of to your point about the flashlight analogy. Or yeah, I would say that there's a book by Carl Sagan called The Demon Haunted World, and it's science is a candle in the dark or something along those lines. And that's kind of the point. And in all scientific disciplines, it's really a small light in a very, very dark room. And because it's a small light, you don't know the dimensions of the room. So you're kind of just like stumbling around and you find things, but you can't put them into context because you're missing more information than you could ever understand. Because we're limited by our senses. Our senses only pick up certain sensory information. There's a whole conversation that extends off of this about like the expansiveness of what exists. Science gives us a slight insight, and I think this is where our pragmatism comes in. Max and I, we're really performance driven. It's like, are you getting better or are you not? What's the outcome we're looking for? We know certain adaptations can contribute to performance. So changes in muscle size, changes in muscle diameter, right? That's likely going to increase force production. So it's probably a good idea to build some muscle if you want to increase your performance potential. And it's like, okay, well, what are the adaptations for maximal strength? You should probably drive those up. What do they look like in practice? Well, it's an increase in a high intensity or high load set. Okay, so we got a PR in that. We're probably stronger. And then it's like, okay, what's the technical change, the coordination adaptation? We use, certain constraints to drive that, and then we sequence that into the full lifts. Oh, we snatched a PR. That program worked more than it didn't, because we made progress. And then it's using that iterative process of getting closer to best. But all these studies, all this information, when you kind of unpack what science is, you realize there are tons of limitations. I mean, I read a paper, I think it was a review paper by the lead author was Mike Roberts. But it was on sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And it's like, here are studies that show that it could happen, and this is what it is. Here are studies that show that it didn't happen. Why is that the case? Why don't they all show the same thing? And it's like, oh, because of the methods, the measurement, the subjects, there's so many limitations and so many constraints and so many concessions that it's like, let's get closer to better or best. And to Max's point, people are still making progress and still winning championships and competition. So we're not completely wrong. So we have to define, coaching expertise differently than if we were just basing on purely, an understanding. And Cote and Gilbert they did a paper on coaching effectiveness and expertise. And they have athlete outcomes is one of those criteria. It's like, how are your athletes performing? So you can have, all the knowledge in the world, and then the application of that, what does it do? And I think what we're trying to do is basically merge those two to where people can get results, people can know how to get results, but can we merge them and get better results? And we're just, we're saying, let's triangulate all the information we have and bring that in. I mean, I'm not against, if you give me a paper, some pain science thing that's on rehab, and it talks about like load management and load tolerance and training tolerance. And it's like, we should probably have an intro week or a ramping period into higher volumes We probably shouldn't just be thrown into it. That makes sense to me. And then if you can take information from like skill acquisition and apply it, and from whatever biomechanical space and apply it, and you start to piece together what looks like, performance science. And that's basically what's been done. And that's what we're trying to proliferate and educate people on.
I really like that. In preparing for this and thinking about the questions I wanted to ask and some of the avenues I wanted to go down, that was very much one of the things that was coming forward for me is exactly what you said of being able to take that pragmatic approach and still be able to look at what is it that we currently understand, knowing that may change over time. Our results are still being driven forward, and our ideas or our understanding of why that worked may change. And
Right.
that's what's really cool about the scientific process. And looking at that from, Max, you've got your years of experience and applied sides of this, and Josh, your side of the academic side of being able to put those two things together in a way that is still coaching athletes and still driving them forward is really neat and really, really cool.
Well, I think Max and I don't know, we have like different backgrounds, but we've kind of converged to where it's like highly, analytic. I don't want to say data driven, but it's like it's informed. It's very informed. It's as informed as possible. It's like that curiosity piece is almost as important as anything else. It's like, how do we get people better results? How do we get people stronger, performing better? Like the entire process, like enjoying training, doing well, looking good, all of it. And then it's coming from the experiential side of having done it and having worked with coaches. And it's not resting on the laurels of, but if you do, it's kind of a common, joke now, but it's like, if you do a Texas method, you'll get results. It's like, maybe you will, maybe you fucking hate training after you do it because it's awful. And like, I've done, that whole thing and missed a 5th rep and a PR set of 5 more times than I can count. And I hated it. That's not fun. At the same weight every time. So I think what we do is you like experience, theory, curiosity, all these things, you put it into a cauldron, you bubble it up, and then you get Coachlogik, you get kind of the products that come out of it, and you get our coaching.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I think that to reiterate one point Josh made is curiosity is like probably one of the most fundamental cornerstones of being good at anything you do, because inherently, unless it's something like, I mean, something that comes so naturally to you, or something that requires no skill, right? Like you're gonna have to try to get better. So like as a coach, I can't imagine being a coach and not having a sense of curiosity. How can I get better? How can I do this? How can I do that? And like it doesn't necessarily mean that your curiosity is always like, reading research papers, but if you just believe you figured it out in anything, whatever it is, software development, right? Like you've got to keep pushing yourself outside the box, outside your comfort zone, trying to learn, trying to, figure things out more. Like that's just so fundamental to being any kind of successful coach.
Well, and if you think about this in the context in which it occurs, which is a pool of coaches, and as that number increases, what you're going to see is that more people are committed to the process and learning more and understanding more, which is what we're seeing. Like we have people in the mentorship. I have a lot of friends in coaching who are like sharp. They're sharp. They want to know more. They're curious. They have like this intense thirst for knowledge, information, and applying it, and they're crushing it. And you realize that like there's a process of evolution by natural selection, and it's like the people who are most fit are going to thrive, and the people who aren't, I mean, they're just not going to do well. I mean, and they might, work with a few people and have it as a side hustle, but it's like as the space increases in size, you just have to be better at what you do. You have to be more well-rounded. I mean, the people who are in, more popular spaces or bigger spaces, like in medicine, it's like those people have the most freakish CVs and backgrounds and like time just like logging hours in a hospital or wherever. And it's like, oh, you have to compete with that because that's the standard now. It's just in coaching, the standard's always been floor level. It's like, do you have a pulse? Well, you're not going to get up off the ground, but maybe you can like, send me a voice note later of like my workout. So I think it's just elevating from that point to, kind of where other professional sports are, where we've talked to Aaron Kunanen, who works for the Reds. He's the director of applied sports science. They have force plates and pitching mounds. They're looking at every single thing you can look at to say that was a great pitch. It was a home run. It wasn't the pitcher's fault. Therefore, and they're connecting, they have more data. They're trying to make more sense of it, and they're utilizing it differently. And I think that's where weightlifting should go if it wants to like become a professional sport, a legitimate sport. But also, that's like natural evolution of a sport, is to not just kind of be satisfied with like good enough.
Yeah. Wanting to push that next level. Mentor of mine reminds me constantly of I'll take curiosity and discipline over inspiration and I forget what the other thing he says, inspiration and motivation any day.
Yeah, that's great.
And I'm reminded also of something I heard on another podcast of in this idea of curiosity and driving yourselves forward, especially as us coaches, and being curious in that regard is to stop thinking like Newton and start thinking more like Darwin. Start thinking about how things became the way that they became versus what they are. Especially for like new coaches, I found myself in that of like, tell me what the answer is so I can learn the answer and I can parrot it back to my athletes or whatever it is. Tell me how I'm supposed to program instead of like diving into that. How am I supposed to program? How am I supposed to make those decisions? How am I supposed to cultivate what that looks like as a coach?
Yeah. The thing about that is that's hard. That's really hard, because the way I've learned and the way Max has learned, someone's like, I was, showing people how to count cards at a local meet recently, and they're like, oh, thanks. Like, I never thought of that. And I'm like, yeah, the first time I had to count, Glenn Pinlay was like almost blind and post stroke. And I was at the Arnold, and he's like, hey, can you come in the back with me? It was like an A session. And, he just kind of sat in the corner, and he was like, here's how you count. And then he just sat there and he was like dead quiet. And I was like, I guess this is like my life now. And I learned to, like, I counted, and I think I could have made a better decision, but the guy crushed it. And after that, it's like counting at a fucking meet is the easiest thing in the world. Like, I don't know why people get super stressed about it. Like, yeah, if you have 10 athletes on the same platform, that's hard. But like counting for one person, are you kidding me? Yeah. That's the bar. Like, that's real.
And that story would have been so much better if they all bombed out.
But and that's the thing with this program, is sometimes you get frustrated because it's like there's no stock ready-made way of doing anything. It's more so like, hey, here's some force plates, go collect some data. And it's like, what do you mean? It's like, yeah, go figure it out. And like, that's the process. And that's kind of where you get thrown in with all of this stuff. And I think that doesn't feel great. People want to pay, $150 for the solution, but it's like, you pay $150 for the opportunity to find a solution, not for the solution. And that sucks. I don't like it either sometimes, but like, it's far more valuable that way than it would be to pay $150 for a pre-written program that gets you success. Because then what do? You just give that to your athletes and you're done. You retire, feet up. You're in Barbados with a Mai Tai on the beach. Like, no, it's a process, and you figure out the fucking process.
Wait, you don't want that? Oh, that's
I mean, okay. That's later, Max.
I was excited. I was like, yeah, that sounds good. No, we don't want. Okay.
Sign me up. Oh, whoops. Yeah. And as you guys, so I'm curious, how did this collaboration of creating this, how did that start? How did that happen?
Josh is kind of just a parasite that was hanging on to ride my coattails. No,
he just started hanging around someday.
Yeah. Josh and I have known each other for a while, and we were both, I think, kind of in the space of like. So I see it like Josh's podcast and the number of guests he's had on and everything he's done there is second to none, especially in the weightlifting world by orders of magnitude. He has the best podcast out there from a coaching science perspective. The problem with a lot of this, and it's not to say there aren't good coaches educating people, but the what we saw was more like there's just not a sort of pipeline of scientific research and like high level academic research being filtered into the weightlifting world in the way that it is in like the powerlifting world. It's so common to see. I mean, how many powerlifting coaches can you think of that would put the words like evidence-based or
Mm.
data-driven into their bios? Because it's a prolific concept that is well respected in that community. And you don't see that in weightlifting. You don't see anyone, no, that's not true. You don't see a lot of people really sitting there talking about research they've seen, or pulling data in and saying we should do this and that. Like, a lot of it is kind of like it's probably 90% focused on, you know, they know the tips and tricks and cues and this and that and the technical aspects. And, they can also just, whatever, stand in a, stand in their driveway and tell you about, why it's this way or that way. Um, Rather than, not necessarily being super nerdy, but being thoughtful and saying, hey, like let's turn every stone over looking for solutions to make us more informed, to make us better, so that we can do a better job. Um,
Mm.
and I think it probably comes down to like, I don't know what it is, like why it's like that, but it comes down to there not being anything like that. And if it doesn't exist, then we should make it. And we should
Mhm.
do something that is to say, hey, let's pull these people you've talked to, you've had so many guests on. Let's create a mentorship program that is sort of built around this idea and try to grow it into something where it's a very big group that is very much in discussion about these ideas and doing it in a way that's not dogmatic. We're not saying like do it our way. We're saying let's all try and find some common knowledge and we can all rely on it and use it.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's just they're two different perspectives. And I think with the way we're trying to do things is it's forward looking. It's like if we get more science, if we get more research into the space, we can do more research. If we do more research, we can answer better questions. We can answer better questions, we can create better training. You get more people into the space, you have more funds or resources. So like if I get into academia and then I can conduct research, I can answer these questions or better answer them or provide answers. So it's like, how can we create something by which the condition is met to build better coaching?
Mhm.
Or you can be in the coaching space and think of like, what do I look back on and rely on? And it's like, I read all these Russian manuals and whatever, and like, I'm up to speed. I don't need to look at research or science. The reality of it is, you know, that we're able to talk now because of, technology, which is built on the back of curiosity, intellectual science, rigorous thinking, testing. So like we'll say that, hey, in medicine, I love science. I trust it. I believe in it. In all these other pursuits, right? But like in coaching and performance, we don't need that. And that's like a weird thing, right? And I think a
Yeah.
lot of it is it's the intellectual rigor of it. Um, because science has been there. I think I pulled up something that I found interesting. The first kind of like controlled trial, like scientific trial, was actually in 1747. It was on a ship where they were trying to cure scurvy. So it's like for hundreds of years we've been using the scientific method to say like, if we do this thing, what's the effect? Is it better than not doing it or something else?
Mhm.
Okay, now let's like look at that across time with different populations, and then we can get, I don't know, we can get vaccines, right? That
Mhm.
can help render a pandemic kind of like more manageable. And that happened fast because resources were pumped to it and research was done. So science has a place, the scientific method has a place, and it's like, how do we embed that in coaching, embed that in weightlifting, and then take that forward to answering better questions and creating better solutions or finding better solutions for all the coaching and performance concerns we have, which is how do we get everyone better and how do we get them to be the best they can be? So that's kind of where I think the mindset shift has gone to for us.
Mhm. I really like that, especially, being a newer coach myself of like it's oftentimes where you do feel lost in like, where do I go? And so you start looking for any solution that anybody's got especially in the social media space of, well, this person's posting a lot of things that make sense on the surface, so I'm going to move this way. Many of us as coaches, we're good at the relationship side, or we're good at the relating to our athletes because we've either been athletes or that's a strength of ours. And to your point, Josh, of looking at the academic rigor side of it is foreign to many of us who may not have studied in that, or it's been a while since we have studied something like that. So I do appreciate and I do enjoy like that. This is something that you guys are bringing into the world. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I think there's like, as to add one more point to the social media thing too, like presenting the illusion of expertise, intelligence, experience, like knowledge is easy to do, right? If you speak with a lot of confidence, if you have an Instagram account that puts out lots of tidbits and factoids and, these things, the X and the check mark, and like, this is wrong and that's right.
Standing in a grocery aisle and screaming at that this is going to kill you if you look at it.
What's his name? What's that fucking guy, Dr. Saldino, who's just like full of shit? Like that guy, like if you just tell people stuff with lots of confidence, it becomes very easy to present a facade, present a, hey, this guy must be an expert because he has a lot of followers. They have a lot of followers, and they're just giving all this info out. It's like a squat university thing, right? It's like all of those things are, it's all largely just sort of, it's designed to do something. It is a sales pitch, right? Or it is a lead magnet, right? It's like, it's just trying to pull you in to sell you something later.
Yeah.
Not to say that we don't run businesses that try to sell people something, but the difference is that it's, somebody who is designing the business to sell, to make a profit versus having something to offer and then monetizing that by selling it. And so, yeah, it's like like you said, like young coaches get sucked in. It's like, if you imagine your entire weightlifting knowledge, your entire career knowledge base, the place that you retrieved information from was just a million collections of 30-second Instagram posts. Your whole understanding of the snatch and the clean and jerk is these and check marks, like, the first pull is actually a push. Like that, who fucking cares what it is? Like, how do you do it? How do you get someone to do it better? Like, it's just like a perfect example of like, that's people's understanding of like a foundational, how do you become a weightlifting coach? Oh, you like go on YouTube or Instagram and like you watch little tidbits and like snatches are this way, jerks are that way. And if you ask someone who had a knowledge base built entirely from the ground up that way, a question that required them to think fundamentally, they couldn't do it because it's just a collection of little pieces, not actually a good understanding of like, well, what do the muscle, like what makes, joints move? How do they move? What makes muscles work? How do you coordinate a bunch of muscles together to create a movement? Like all these things start to become easy. It's if you have the fundamentals and the broad base, it's very easy to get to the other place. You can't go the other way though.
Yeah,
it's almost
when I think too, you have to avoid. This is very tough, and I think my disposition doesn't allow me to do this. You can't say I had success, therefore it was my method. We failed, therefore it was them. And no good coach. I mean, you can do that, and sometimes it makes sense, but like realistically, okay, but how could I have curtailed the situation that we would have had success? So I think a lot of that is like, what's the other Jocko thing? Something about responsibility, unreasonable responsibility.
With great power comes great responsibility.
That's exactly it. But it's like, it's saying as a coach, as a coach, like I can have influence over everything. I can make decisions that impact everything. And when something doesn't work, it's because I didn't make the best decisions. And like, yeah, there's a lot of like falsity in that, but there's a lot of empowerment and just accepting that lot. And there's another anecdote, and it was like woman was at a cocktail party, and she was like talking to a psychiatrist or someone, and talking about like, oh, well, is this issue I have, like, is this something that I have to deal with, or is this something that I can like change? And it's like, well, why do you want to know? It's like, well, if I can change it, then I have some sense of responsibility and some sense of like autonomy over it. If it's something I just kind of have to deal with, it removes personal control. And I think people getting into the space, you get all these facts, and then you have success, and it's like, it's all me, and then you have failure, and it's all them. And it's like personal responsibility, personal control, like the failures and the successes. And then I think, and that's why when Max and I talk, like we had an entire conversation over coach education and kind of the space. We didn't once say like, do 5 sets of 3 at 70% week 1, 4 sets of 3, 75% week 2, test your best triple on week 3.
Yeah.
Because it's unhelpful. It doesn't really do anything. And I think it creates this false illusion of what coach education is, which isn't prescriptions, it's direction.
Yeah, if you go down the route of giving people prescriptions, or even to the point of the series of YouTube and YouTube University clips or Instagram University clips, is that you create this idea of if then else.
Yes.
And so then you're no longer actually asking questions. You're
Right.
you're grasping for solutions. It's
Right.
like it reminds me of like some of the early like ideas of AI that people were putting out, which were just decision trees. And I was like, this isn't an AI. This is a bunch of if then statements that are just looping themselves somewhere, and we have no idea which ones are actually effective or not.
Yeah, well, it's like and that's a great point, because it's also understanding the difference between those two things, which is like deterministic and non-deterministic,
Mm-hmm.
because we function in a non-deterministic space here. You give an input to an athlete and you're not sure exactly what the output's going to
Yeah.
be. It's not
Mm-hmm.
always the same. And that's like that kind of thinking is so difficult for people to wrap their minds around. To touch on the point Josh made earlier, you know, the logic of saying when it rains, the ground gets wet. And then you walk outside and the ground is wet, you would then be like, oh, it's raining. It must have rained. Well,
Mm-hmm.
no, those are not connected. This is not the same. Like that logic doesn't work. It's the ground gets wet when it rains. The ground could also just be wet. Like that's not, it's not always that way. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's this thinking, which is the YouTube University, the sort of Instagram stuff is like, you know, how to fix this. And it's like, here's the cue, here's the exercise. And those are like good starting points. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine to say like, hey, how do you know, my snatch is weak overhead. Overhead squats. Like, sure,
Yeah.
that's obvious connection. But it's the more broad sense, which is like, how do I get better? How do I
Mm-hmm.
become a good lifter? How do I get stronger? And it is not it has to be principle based. It has to be rooted in trade-offs and a non-deterministic system that you would have to understand that doing this is likely to produce that outcome. If it doesn't produce that outcome, maybe something else needs to be
Mm.
addressed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, we are coming up on the end of our discussion. Final thoughts, Josh? Anything
Yeah,
that
I
you would
thought it
like
was
to share with the audience as a final thought? Yeah.
I would say that a lot of this was built on the back of, and kind of to Max's point, it's like I really found a deep interest in weightlifting specifically, but it was like philosophy and science, and like having having those two worlds merge, where it's like hard sciences, foundational information, ways of thinking. Um, because a lot of that stuff, I actually think back on, I'm like, oh, it makes more sense now in the context of training than it did then, even though I had access to the same information. And it's also that idea of just because it doesn't matter now doesn't mean it won't matter later. So put all the work in early on. Later on, you can access it, utilize it, inform everything that you do and understand. So I thought it was a great conversation, Jeremy. Super appreciative that you had us both on.
Yeah. Thank you.
It was a great time. It was a great
Yeah.
time.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. In looking at how can people get a hold of either of you? How can they learn more about the Coachlogik mentorship program?
Yeah, I mean, check it out. You can find us both on Instagram. Obviously, I think Josh will give his, but you can find me Max_Ada. You can email me. You can check out the Coachlogik mentorship. Shoot us a DM, either one of us on Instagram. And then if you're interested, go ahead and check out everything else we offer as far as coaching and whatnot. And then we'll be relaunching the Coachlogik coaching platform in June. So beginning of June, right around nationals or at nationals. So yeah, check that out. That's going to be an entire coaching platform, basically built off of everything we discussed here, as far as giving you the tools to accurately track training, deliver training, and do things that are going to elevate your coaching, to the level it should be at.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you guys so much. We'll have the details on how you can learn more in the show notes down below. Very appreciative of you both being here. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for listening and supporting the podcast. As always, stay strong, folks. And most importantly, stay weird.